Bienvenidos a Citacus Life. En el programa de hoy abordaremos la importancia y los beneficios de la cría en cautividad en la conservación de especies. Para profundizar en este tema tenemos el honor de contar con la participación de tres expertos destacados. Carlos Vicente, licenciado en Biología y conservador del Acuario de Zaragoza. Beate Fau, destacada zoóloga y asesora experta en gestión de proyectos internacionales en la Sociedad Alemana de Herpetología y Herpetocultura, y Pedro Romero, investigador postdoctoral en la Universidad Pablo de Olavide y en el Centro Alemán de Investigación Integrativa de la Biodiversidad. Sin más preámbulos, les damos la bienvenida y comenzamos este fascinante debate sobre la cría en cautividad y su impacto en la conservación de especies.
Hi, Carlos. Hi, Beate.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to be today with you here.
I'm sorry I could not come.
Yes, I'm really happy to have this talk with you about this important item today, no? This, a captive breed for conservation.
Yes, I think it's a really important topic to discuss. I'm really happy to discuss it with people that comes from a different background than me, but I think also really important for the conservation of species and biodiversity. So also it's really nice to have you, even if it's on video, Beate.
Hi.
Nice to meet you in person as well one day.
One day, yes. I'm sorry that I could not come to Barcelona this time, but later we will certainly meet at some scientific meetings.
Yes, and sure. And well, as you know, I come from the scientific background, more focused on research. For me, it's really, really nice to have your perspective also on something that I don't cover on my daily basis. As a conservation biologist, that is kind of a new discipline that involves many, many different aspects. People think it's mostly ecology, but it's not true. But for example, genetic diversity and many aspects that some people don't know. And I think you're also for collecting data on the species is really important. For example, breeding in captivity, that is what brings us to here, I guess, and to collect data and information on the species. So I'm really glad to be able to talk to you about this, and maybe I will learn also a lot on this topic. And I guess for you it's also really important, as you know, that we are seeing on the media all the time. We are on a really important critical moment for biodiversity, that the biodiversity loss is really fast. We are losing a lot of species. And by the time that some scientists discover new species, they are almost disappearing already. And I think what you do is super important. And a lot of people only focus on science, as scientists say, and scientists are doing this research, but they usually forgot about, for example, the part that involves zoos or aquariums, that I think is Carlos, for example. You will explain much better.
Yes, no,
as
you say, science magazines, for example, in February of 2023, had done a paper talking about the critical situation of the species, some groups of species in the Earth planet, and they talk about the captive breed is a reality that we need to save these species. Well, we was talking in the breakfast this morning about there is some species like pandas or big eagles that is really easy, or lynx, Iberian lynx, is really easy to protect these species, but the work of zoos and aquariums are focused on other species that nobody care about these species like little fishes or snails. A lot of zoos are working on snails like Partula from French Guiana, French Polynesia, sorry. And I think the captive breed is a tool and very necessary at this moment in our situation.
And well, also, Beate, I think you also come from a different background as part of a society that works in many different aspects. I think will be nice for you also to explain to us, because I know a little bit, but it's always better when the person who is involved in this can explain it.
Okay, we do very much the same. We try to conserve the species. We are a big German society, mainly German-based. We have 6,000 members, but we are organized very in the German way with work groups and with local groups and in a network with other societies. And we also work with the zoos, but we have the focus on reptiles and amphibians, and very often those are species that are not attractive for the main public because they are not colorful, and also not so attractive for zoos because they are nocturnal and very not really showy. But we have lots of private breeders who do breeding and knowledge gaining with them. And in our society, we have a very good interchange with all the disciplines of science, with geneticists, with taxonomists, with veterinarians, with field herpetologists, and very often with people who are in where the animals come from. We try to do an information exchange besides keeping stable populations in captivity.
Yeah. Actually, well, Beate, what you just said, I think is also really interesting, because when you look at the general public, they know that there is some species that they are in danger, but they always focus, for example, on pandas, on rhinos. Yeah. And it's actually amphibians, for example, is one of the vertebrates group that is decreasing faster. Not only the species that they are in danger by extinction, but also the populations are really, really threatened. So yes, they are more isolated because of several threats, diseases, and loss of habitat, for example. But most part of people don't know. So the importance of your work is critical for conservation of species, I think.
Yes, when you are talking about amphibians, there we have a daughter society, or whatever we call it. We call it citizen conservation. They make a lot of publicity, and they started from Frogs and Friends 5 years ago, and they tried to establish captive colonies of very endangered amphibians with a cooperation of zoos and private people. And they do a lot of publicity in the German media mainly to show the general public that it's important to take care not only of pandas and lynx and whatever you show your animals you have, but also of the biodiversity network where the amphibians play a very important role.
Amphibians are a very threatened group, and tortoise and turtles, for example, due to their biology, they are living slow, don't breathe so much, and reptiles in general are affected very much about climate change, not because they depend on the weather for their life. If, for example, we are working in our aquarium, in Zaragoza Aquarium, with Rana pyrenaica, It's a little frog that they only lives in Pyrenees, and their population, their distribution is very restricted, and some populations are disappearing about coronavirus, or they are losing their habitat directly, no? And administration can't work with an species if this species isn't directly threatened. Then they say, Aragon government said to the aquarium, we know that will be in a very hard situation in the next 5-6 years, but we can work with this species now. Can you work with this species? And I think those zoos and aquarium are a really nice tool for the administration to work with these species. Maybe they don't have the knowledge to work with for keep and breed some amphibians at this moment, but zoos and aquariums, we have the technicians to work with these species.
Yeah, and also many years of experience and
yes,
many knowledge gathered on this. So yes, I completely agree. Because for example, when we think on my part of work, that is, I'm really focused on human impact, but focus on conflict with humans, no? That involves, for example, deforestation, and my main topic is illegal wildlife trade, but it's whatever involves conflict between human and wildlife. And for example, when we think on habitat loss, like the deforestation of areas like Amazonia, is so fast that when we can catalog a species as endangered, maybe it's nothing to do. You cannot save it because you don't have the time to start a project. Administration is slow to start to collect individuals to breed in captivity and to try to save the species. Maybe you have already lost the species. So the work that zoos and breeders do is critical for this, because you don't need to pass all this administration process. People has already gathered this knowledge and knows how to do it, and when it's needed, you can use it, or you can help administrations to work on this.
In the first moment, at this moment, we are a biobank. We are a genetic store of a lot of species, and we are working in a cryobank. We are freezing some universities and museums. We are working with zoos and aquariums to get genetic material to store for work in the next years. No? And it's more easy come to Zaragoza to take samples than Amazonian or Asia or Australia. Then we are an easy place to take samples. And we have another tools like stud books or EEPs and monitoring programs to manage this population at this moment. No? Then we can work this work at this moment. That is now is necessary to do this work.
Yeah, as an interesting fact, for example, I work mostly on parrots, and there is a species of parrots in the area of Oceania and Indonesia that in the native areas they are practically or virtually extinct. Yeah. And they survive in the wild because they were exported to other countries, they escape, and now they live in the wild in cities. Like, for example, even Hong Kong, on areas like this, there is the biggest population of this species, not in the native area that is kilometers away and in other islands. And that's really important because it's a genetical bank that is basically really important in conservation, because if you have few individuals, you probably cannot reintroduce them. If they are all really related, you will have a genetical problem. You don't have diversity, so really interesting.
I have a question for you. How you, like a scientific, how you think captive breed can help you?
Well, my project during the last years was focused on the impact of illegal trade on parrots in the neotropics. But it's not international illegal trade that is the most famous, like for example with rhino horse, pangolins, and what's the illegal trade that happens inside the countries, that people that trap animals to have it inside this country, that doesn't go for exports. And what we saw is that is incredible high, the volume of animals that they are trapped every year to have it in the house as pet and sell it in markets and things. And nowadays is much bigger than international illegal trade. And it happens because, especially after 1992, and that was a ban on import in USA on wildlife, and after that in European Union in 2005, the number of exports of wild-caught animals really reduced and start to appear a market of breeding in captivity. Yeah. So a lot of countries, instead of looking for animals in the origin, they start to look for animals in captive breeders. And what we saw is from thousands and thousands of individuals that they were extracted from the nature, for example, in countries as Argentina, for Amazonia stiva, that is really popular as pet, or in Peru, they were substituted, but for example, in this case, parrots, breed in captivity in Europe. So we completely changed the trend. So from being importers of animals trapped in the wild, we become exporters of animal breed in captivity, reducing incredibly the pressure on illegal trade on these species. Yes. And for example, now the problem is not that we are importing animals illegally. The problem is these countries are still trapping animals yes. to have it as pets. And a solution will be breeding captivity and make available for these people options that they are not really expensive. And it's more interesting than going and trap these animals in the wild or buy it. So I think it's critical.
Yes, I think captive breed some species can reduce the impact of wild population, but can be an economic source for local people too.
As well, yeah. As well, it would be really important if they could make it sustainable, because what they are doing now, for example, in countries as Bolivia, is not sustainable at all. We collect data on a wildlife market that they sell parrots, monkeys, and other animals during 5 years. And the numbers we observe of parrots are 10 times order magnitude higher than the whole legal exportation of Bolivia during the whole time we have records from CITES. So much than 10 times bigger than the whole legal exports. It's just on 5 years on a market. So if you have a substitute and also make people involved, it could be a really good way to work on this. Especially for species that they are really in danger. Like for example, Ara rubrogenis, that only a few individuals last in the wild, and they still trap them. So if they do that, it's not gonna work for them.
Yes, I think the education is more important for local people too, but some species are threatened because they hunt them not only for keeping captivity, yes. Maybe for consume or for eat them, or traditional medicine in some cases. But I have a question for you too, because I think in German, in Spain we are working in this side, and I think we have better associations with the time. We are working in this, but I think in German you have a very strong structure with pathological associations and another kind of private breeders. Do you have working with zoos and aquariums? These associations are working hand to hand with zoos, aquariums, even administration, government?
Yes, there are several associations or cooperations with zoos. You know, the European Zoo and Aquarium Association, they just started to work together with private breeders. It depends on the species or on the person who is responsible. And just 3 weeks ago, they introduced a captive breeder as a consultant for the Aldabra giant tortoise. So this is an official cooperation between the zoos, all the European zoos, and private breeders on breeding and management of the giant tortoise. With other animals, it doesn't work like this, but it depends. And some zoos and some managers work with private people, others don't. But we have some zoo managers within the German Herpetological Society, and from there we can give input how to, for example, exchange animals, because when you want to captive breed a population to keep them, you need a population size. And you have to not put all the eggs in one basket, but you have several breeders who have the groups. And therefore, for many animals, we need those private breeders. One example is that citizen conservation. Those are zoo animals which are given to private breeders for reproduction. There's a coming Stutbook to keep the genetic diversity and to keep the local forms separate. For example, for our fire salamander, which has several local forms. And there we do breed with zoos. With other species, especially for turtles, it's not so easy because we have private breeders that work among them, but we do not have a zoo who wants to take care of managing those private breeder groups. So it's a bit difficult. We have several organizations within the German Herpetological Society where the interchange of information or of animals with zoos is regulated in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite a political topic, because we always say zoos want to have showy animals, and we have the animals which are not that showy, but it depends on the manager and on the personality. And you know that Germans are a bit difficult in personality sometimes and in organization. So I cannot speak for everything. We do our best to get a good cooperation and to do a good work together, everybody with his strengths as he has. And what we should not forget is we have the zoo people, and we also have scientists, and most of our members are private keepers and breeders of a lot of animals. Even the zoo people have private animals, and so it's often easier to exchange information the unofficial way when we sit at the meeting and discuss and transfer animals from one hand to the other.
Yeah, I think that
very
we just say is really important.
Yeah, very important is also our cooperation with, for example, the European Stutbook Foundation, that takes care of other private breeders who have one species, and they try to manage that ex situ population without a manager who has a job at the zoo. We have some breeders that are working in a zoo in that association, but usually the manager of that such a Stutbook group is a private person who is very experienced. Okay?
Yes, actually about that you say about working together and the importance of working together. I have a question that what is the importance of, for example, breeders, zoos, and aquariums on collecting data and specific data about the biology and the ecology of the different species? Because as an ecologist that work on the field, I know that sometimes it's completely impossible to collect data of species that they are really difficult to observe. And for example, regarding fishes and amphibians, sometimes you cannot even access to this in the wild. It's really complicated. And Carlos, I remember you were explaining me this morning a really interesting example about salamanders that I really like it.
I was reading this morning and we were talking about hellbender salamander in United States. Are a very secretive species, and people was studying them, and the population were in decline, no? And don't know what or the cause of this decline. Then one scientific in a talk of St. Louis Aquarium. St. Louis Aquarium had a breeding project with this species of salamander, and they are captive breeding this species, and he thought, well, maybe I can apply this method in the river for observe the hellbenders. Then, and the males are defending some nesting place, and before the larvae hatch, the males was eaten the eggs. Then the population was in decline. And they can see that this occurs in deforested areas, only in deforested areas. And well, something that an aquarium apply in a captive breed project can be applied in wild to observe these species and to have more knowledge about the biology. Yes.
Really interesting. I also remember a case that is with parrots actually, and it was with kakapos that they are super endangered. It really costs a lot of money in New Zealand every year to try to breed them. They move to different islands where they don't have predators, and they have a problem several years ago, and it's because all the individuals that they were born, they were males. And it was a researcher actually who also was breeding parrots in captivity who discovered that was because of food. The food they were given to kakapos were not okay, so they were having mostly males, and they needed females in order to recover the species. So that's, for example, examples of data that you can gather by breeding them in captivity and observing during the whole time species that in wild are almost impossible to observe or really complicated to collect data, no?
We have a similar case. We have a cooperation, or one of our members has a cooperation with a South African herpetologist. And there's a very small tortoise there, which lives in crevices. It's very difficult to observe. And that South African herpetologist asked in this case, a Dutch breeder, to import some specimens, to collect them and bring them to his house and breed them to find out how many eggs they produce, where they have the threshold temperature for making males and females, and so on. And it was the cooperation that the herpetologist from South Africa started with a captive breeder to get the data which he needed for biotope management later. And a similar thing we have with those little glass frogs. They are very secretive. You can't access the biotopes in Mesoamerica. They live in the mountains up there. And those frogs, they have brood care. The males take care of the eggs and even for the tadpoles. And we found out that glass frogs, many species are threatened by a disease, and that if we have a resistant father of the juveniles, he will even pass on his microbiome to the tadpoles, to the young frogs, so that they will be resistant to that disease. But you have to know how it works with the brood care. You need to know the behavior to manage it. Then perhaps we can breed them in captivity so that we can reintroduce some resistant males into the biotope so that they can breed with the females there and then pass their resistance to that disease to their offspring. We hope so. We are just at the beginning of that project, but it's not possible without the cooperation of the people in the range countries and our veterinarians in this case and our private breeders, which we have here. It's nocturnal species. They are not easy to breed in zoos because the zoo staff has to leave the zoo at night, but it's better to breed those grass frogs in private houses where the people are there all night long. Okay, similar projects, similar as the kakapos, similar as the salamanders, and to introduce another project, our fire salamander, you see my t-shirt, we have the problem that they are endangered here in Germany because of a disease that is rapidly spreading. And if we see that the disease is coming, we try to get some salamanders into captivity and breed them and treat them. In captivity, they can be treated and have a reserve population. And when the disease is past that area, then we can release the animals with a local adaptation in their original biotope. And in the meantime, we have them in our basement. So those are the projects we have for species conservation, but it's always necessary to have several people with several qualifications who are involved in that.
Yeah, I think it's also really important what you were talking about, because diseases are expected to get more common also in the wild, because there is a, let's say, ecosystem stress that we are maybe reducing too much the habitats of the species, we are changing the ecological situation, and that could provoke that new diseases appear. With amphibians, we already experienced what happens with chytridiomycosis and ranavirus was completely catastrophic, but this is expected to happen more often, as is now happening with avian flu and this. So to keep animals in captivity, that they are away from the wild, is really important, because I can remember, for example, in Spain we have the case of Iberian lynx, that is our flag species and one of the most important species that was destinating money to preserve it. But it was a moment, really critical moment, that almost disappeared because a disease that comes from cats, that is leukemia from cats, and it almost disappeared. And because they are not really diverse genetically, and a disease like that can wipe completely a species. So it's really important to preserve a stock of this species that is away of these areas, and it can be kept from these diseases to really have this impact on the species and on the populations. That is also important.
I think we need to improve our work together with private breeders, zoos, aquarium administration, because it's scientifics. Because I think there is a little fear about the work together sometimes, and I think we can learn from each other.
Yeah. For example, I I was lucky, and I was not only working with animals on the field, I was also working with people. So I think it's important because it gives you this wider comprehension of how it works. And I was asking, I cannot even say a number of how many people I interview in South America, and this asking about why they trap these species, what they give them for food, how they trap it, and all these questions that actually I learned a lot. But I learned a lot why they do it, and the impact that it has on the populations, the importance for them, and all of this. Just because talking to people, that is something that usually we don't do. I guess different parts, we don't connect each other too much. And it's really important because we learn a lot of things on the ecology of certain species that they were not really studied, just because the people were saying us where they trap it, or where they give them for food, or things like that. So it's really, really important knowledge to gather between different parts, I guess. Is probably the only way to make a project or something successful.
Yes, but nevertheless, we need support from decision makers like authorities or politicians, because at the moment we have some politicians in Germany, in other countries too, who think that it's enough to put a fence around a certain area to protect the species in there. And that will never work. And so we have to talk with the politicians too, that they make it possible to have that interchange between all the disciplines again, and not just start forbidding and regulating things that work well without regulation, just with common sense. And we are trying to, we are working with the Nature Protection Agency in Germany, who is the leading scientific authority in Europe. And we try to inform the people how they can support our work, what we are doing. And one example is that we are writing or collecting the knowledge on captive breeding or captive husbandry of certain species to inform the authorities that we need to interchange them, and how to find out about illegal trade, and how to manage the animals in captivity. And we are writing books about it. We make presentations, and perhaps you can show the book which we are making just now.
Yes, I think
we have this work.
This is a report on the animals that had been put on CITES appendices because they somebody thought they were endangered by trade, and so the trade has to be regulated. And we want to give those people that have to decide about the trade the information how where they should look, how we are working with those animals, and how we could preserve them. And we are just working on the next report in this case, and there we will also gather information how they can be bred in the countries of origin, and the keyword is sustainable trade, so that the people in the country of origin can profit of breeding those animals. They can contribute to the knowledge, and we also can contribute our knowledge and our experience to preserving the biodiversity. And that's why we make those books, and publications and so on. And we try to involve the decision makers in our work so that they support us.
Actually, one thing you say also, Beate, we were talking this morning with Carlos about it, that was that creating a nature reserve to many people, imagination looks like a wall that nobody can cross, and everything is done. So if you create a nature reserve, species are okay and nothing will happen. And it's not working like this, especially outside of Europe, because, for example, I'm thinking of examples in Madagascar that is really deforested, and there is these national parks and they are protected, and people still extracting wood from protected species. When I was there, they even offered me to eat lemon soup from protected species. So it's not a wall. I mean, they can cross, and people are still hunting illegally. They're still collecting species illegally, and so it's not enough just to create a nature reserve. It's good, but you need also to do other things, because it's not. Or when we think about diseases, no, you have really natural areas we have in Europe, and now that the avian flu entered, species are dying. So it's not enough just to create a nature reserve, and by magical thing, species are going to be protected and safe. No, so there's a lot of work to do behind this, and aside of this, I would say.
Yes, the human conflict is a reality.
Yeah.
Then we need work in education, and we have a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yes, but Beate, congratulations for this work, because I think it's a this book have a very important information for read some rare species. We keep some of these species in the Zaragoza Aquarium. Them is a very useful tool to work with them. And I think private breeders have a lot of information about very uncommon species, and we need breed these species.
Yes, that's true. And there's also, well, my special hobby. It's we have a lot of knowledge. We publish it in our grey literature. And for me, it's important to make that knowledge available to you, to read it, to have species indices and so on, so that everybody who needs more information, more publication, will find what is written about them and will have the context. So that, for example, if you are breeding that, we were talking about the Mata-Mata turtle before, that you can contact our Mata-Mata breeders in Germany and just ask them how to incubate their eggs, because they have some experience which perhaps you might need. So let's work together, and also with Pedro, who is working in the Doñana, there we also have some interesting projects and so on, and in the Pyrenees. And I hope when we publish this dialogue here, we will have contacts of interesting people who are just wanting to contact us and go on talking with us and working together, so that we have a knowledge community, as we call it in Germany.
Yeah, and also, for example, for people like me that were mostly on research and ecology, this material, like this book that you publish, is like a treasure for us, this great literature, because, for example, I can think on some examples of our research. We were trying to measure how attractive parrots were to persons, to see why some species were trapped much more than others. And one thing we assess is the ability to speak of parrots. And there is no information on this that you can collect on the wild, because it's not existing, this information. So actually we contact breeders. So, and there is not any publication on this. We have to contact breeder by breeder, emailing them in order to obtain a number of interviews with this breeder, assessing every single species of parrots to make statistics, to make some tests that we could show these species are selected more because they speak better according to this data we have. So this kind of information for us is like a treasure, and it's not many people who is really sometimes making the effort to, because it's a lot of work, to publish these things and to make it available to the public and also to the scientific community, because they think it's not worthy and it's completely wrong idea. It's one of the most valuable things we can use to then work on different aspects that finally is what we want, to preserve species, to preserve diversity, and I think all of us are in the same idea and in the same boat, let's say.
And mostly of these species are not threatened for the commerce, for keeping them like company animals. Are threatened about los habitat, los del habitat, or for consuming them.
Yeah.
Then at the end, these species are threatened, and we need to help this keeping a population.
Yeah,
There is not other options.
No,
for them.
And what I was saying, like the deforestation and habitat loss sometimes is so fast that the only way to keep them is to have populations in captivity, because it's.
I think captive breed is not the only tool, but it's necessary. We need to keep the habitats, we need to reforest some areas, we need to educate people, but obviously we need captive breed some species to keep them.
But for example, one interesting thing is that research sometimes is slowly. By the way it works, you have to gather the data, you have to work on this data, and then eventually publish this data. That can take, for example, a study about a species of amphibian that lives in Amazonian forest, let's say 2 years. In 2 years, the forest that they were living probably is already cut. And if you preserve patches of it, you need to know if this is enough to preserve the populations. And if it's not, you maybe prove it after 4 years and it's too late. So while we are researching on this, we need to have this like safety thing that the species is not disappearing. Well, if we manage to...
Yes, and sometimes some new species, nobody know about these species, but maybe there are a breeder in France or in Germany or in Spain that he never works with these species, but with others similars. Then you give them these species and they will breed at the first attempt. But sometimes administration don't have these tools or this knowledge, and as you know, you need to do something now to save these species. Then you have the tools and you have the talents. Take the animals and breed them, and we will work to preserve their habitat, and later we reintroduce these animals. It's obvious. Obviously, you need to do this.
We even have done it the opposite way. There were some breeders, in this case of mud turtles, that had special local forms. They gave them a fantasy name and they bred them, and they found out lots of the biology. But then we started talking to the taxonomists and said, well, there is something different. It might be a cryptic species or so. Can you please do some research on it, whether it's a separate species or not? And then we had the species description after our captive breeders had given the taxonomists the information that there's something very different within a certain group of species. So that's the advantage of information exchange. And now it turns out that the species which we were breeding for generations in Europe, it's very endangered in Mexico in this time. And we are going to give them the information about the needs of the species, because they need some shaded places on the borders of the water and so on, which we know from captivity. And we can say, if you want to preserve that biotope, please take care that you have trees at the border of the rivers which you are going to protect, so that the species has everything it needs in that biotope. So we have just the opposite way, not from field scientists to breeders, but from breeders to field scientists and to conservationists.
Yeah, it's very important to work in net and share knowledge, because in some place there is someone to know what you need, no? Then it's important.
Yeah, and I think divulgation also is really important, and it's something that I think we are failing in general, no? Because, for example, scientists, we are really bad at divulgation sometimes, and we can divulgate in Congress that they are specialized on this, but the general public is not aware of what we are doing. So I think divulgation in different medias or accessible to everybody, for example, for scientists, will be really interesting to connect other people that is working on this kind of topics. And I have to say that it's something that we are failing. And scientists, we are not, in general, with some exceptions, really good communicating this to the general public.
I think all of us in this table are really bad communicating our work, because scientists have a vast knowledge about everything. Zoos and aquariums are doing amazing work to protecting the species, and nobody knows. And private breeders are in the same situation. I think it's important to work together and obviously communicate our work in the best way.
Especially because we have to be aware that political decisions are not made on if we are right or not. Yeah. They are made sometimes on how good you are communicating, and the general public can be aware of a problem and can be involved on the solution of this problem. So what you were saying before, Beate, that in Germany things are politically changing sometimes not in a good way. Also, we have this problem in Spain. And I think it's really important that we are able to communicate to people the importance of what we are doing, and also the implications of if we stop it. Like for what is more valuable for biodiversity is to have just species that are nice, like a panda, or all the little species we are losing because we are not working on that, and we are not allowing people to work on that. So I guess that's super important to be able to communicate this to people. So.
Yes, we should do meetings like this more often, or like we are doing in the German Herpetological Society. There's a big room and all the people are sitting there and having a beer, and we invite politicians, and we invite veterinarians, and we invite frog breeders, and we invite turtle breeders, which are mostly very different people. And if they sit together and just talk and interchange their experiences, then we can save the species, which we are all wanting to do. And we just show that we love them, isn't it?
Yeah,
I completely loves the ugly little frog, doesn't he?
I completely agree, Beate, and the idea of having it with a beer also is really interesting. So, yeah, I think...
Well, I think all of us are working with the same goal, that is working to conservation biodiversity, and we need to work together, and I think It's a pleasure to have this talk with you and with Beate, maybe in another time, in another situation with Beate here. But anyway, it's a great talk, and I thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, Beate.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, and see you soon in person.
I hope.
See you.
Okay.
Hoy tenemos el honor de presentar dos obras destacadas. En primer lugar, Evaluación del potencial de cría en cautividad de anfibios y reptiles en CITES COP18, una publicación coescrita por Beate Fau. Esta obra aborda el comercio de reptiles vivos en Alemania y su impacto en la conservación de especies. Nos proporciona una valiosa información sobre la autenticidad de los animales criados en cautividad. Además, nos complace presentar la tesis doctoral de Pedro Romero, titulada Las dimensiones ignoradas del tráfico ilegal de loros domésticos en el Neotrópico. Esta destacada tesis se enfoca en el comercio ilegal de loros, especialmente a nivel doméstico, y su impacto en la conservación de estas aves a nivel global, con especial atención al Neotrópico. Ambas obras son recursos indispensables para comprender el estado de las especies en peligro de extinción, identificar amenazas clave y respaldar estrategias de manejo. Por otro lado, Carlos Vicente nos invita a descubrir una de las iniciativas de conservación que se están llevando a cabo en el Acuario de Zaragoza, el estudio del desarrollo larvario de la rana pirenaica a través de la cría en cautividad. Este magnífico proyecto tiene como objetivo crear conciencia y difundir el valor biológico de esta especie vulnerable, así como los peligros y riesgos que la amenazan. En la página web del Acuario de Zaragoza podremos seguir de cerca todos los proyectos en curso y estar al tanto de las últimas noticias y avances. Sin duda, la recopilación de datos y la colaboración entre científicos es indispensable para asegurar la mayor tasa en la supervivencia de las especies.